Hello, and welcome to English for Philosophy students. This is the Jordan Peterson 12 Rules for Life course. We are starting lesson 46 right now, and it is the fourth lesson in rule number 6. Now, last time we began the section entitled Vengeance or Transformation. The idea of this rule, the beginning of the idea is that life is full of meaningless suffering. Innocent people suffer all the time. Life sucks. The reasonable response, the logically consistent response, would be to be angry and to want to have vengeance, to have revenge against the God who created the system, the person who is responsible for being, for everything that is and the nature of our existence. That would be God or fate. It is natural to be angry and want to get revenge, so that would be vengeance. And the discussion last week simply amplified and explained this idea that it is perfectly understandable that someone would become filled with hate and rage and want to seek vengeance if they perceive the universe as it really is, which is bad. But he says vengeance or transformation. And at the very end of the lesson, last time, in the final paragraph, Jordan Peterson said, but is it inevitable that a person should react with hatred and anger? No. There are examples of people who have suffered and they have not become angry and bitter. In fact, their suffering has transformed them into mature, self-actualized, wise, good, noble individuals. So we are beginning where we stopped last week. Hold on. And I think I am going to try to get a different color since now we are no longer talking. Well, maybe I'll keep this red. I think this red may have been the color I used. Right. Okay, so the red is the color for transformation. The blue must have been the color of vengeance. So let us begin to read. He is talking now about people who are becoming transformed through their sufferings. And there's a new idea in this paragraph. The desire for vengeance, however justified, also bars the way to other productive thoughts. Let's understand that statement before we continue, because I believe it is the thesis, probably, of this paragraph. So, the desire for vengeance, we understand. Of course, you want to get even on whoever did this. He says, however justified. The desire for vengeance, however justified. This phrase, however justified, means basically that the desire for vengeance is reasonable. It is reasonable. But no matter how reasonable that is, there is another way. So that phrase, however justified, is a concession to the idea that, yes, it's reasonable to want vengeance. But there is another way. This desire for vengeance, in addition to being negative in ways we've already spoken of, it also bars the way to other productive thoughts. So if you're going to bar the way, that means you get in the way or you obstruct. So the desire for vengeance, even if it's justified, is an obstacle to productive thoughts. So he was previously saying that this desire for vengeance, it leads you to become a mass murderer or a suicide risk. It is destructive in the extreme. In addition to that, being so incredibly destructive, it also prevents you from other productive things. So let's continue. The American English poet T.S. Eliot explains why in his play, The Cocktail Party. So the question is, why does it bar the way to other productive thoughts? Or more correctly, how does it bar the way? In what sense does the desire for vengeance bar the way to productive thoughts? So, the American poet T.S. Eliot explained why in his play, The Cocktail Party. One of his characters in the play, The Cocktail Party, which, by the way, is on YouTube. I looked it up a long time ago and saw it on YouTube. So in that play, The Cocktail Party, one of the characters is not having a good time of it. A good time of it, that phrase changes it. If it simply said she's not having a good time, period, it means she is not having fun at the cocktail party. She is not enjoying the cocktail party. But if it adds this phrase of it, she is not having a good time of it, that makes it broader. It means she is in a bad time in her life. She may be actually enjoying the cocktail party, but she is in a bad time of life. So that little phrase makes it general. So, one of the characters is not having a good time of it. She speaks of her profound unhappiness to a psychiatrist. So the psychiatrist is at the party, cocktail party, and she is just talking to people, and she begins to speak to this psychiatrist casually, and she talks about how unhappy she is in her life, her profound unhappiness. Not just a little unhappy today, but profound, all-encompassing unhappiness. She speaks of it casually to the guy at the party. She says she hopes that all her suffering is her own fault. She hopes that her suffering is her fault. Now, most people would say, that's weird. The psychiatrist is taken aback. That means he goes, what? He is surprised. That's what taken aback means. The psychiatrist is taken aback. He is surprised. He asks why. Why does she hope that all her suffering is her own fault? Why does she hope that all of her suffering is her own fault? Here's the answer. She has thought long and hard about this, she says. I've thought long and hard about it. Long and hard is a phrase that is frequently used together. It means she has given serious thought to the question, she says, and she has come to the following conclusion. If it is her fault, she might be able to do something about it. If it is God's fault, however, if reality itself is flawed, and if reality itself is hell-bent on ensuring her misery, then she is doomed. She couldn't change the structures of reality itself, but maybe she could change her own life. This idea is not new to conservatives, political conservatives. I am a political conservative, when we look at the minorities in the United States, particularly Black people, and we see that they have terrible cultural problems, including unwed motherhood, poverty, unemployment, drug abuse, all kinds of domestic abuse. Their men, young men, are disproportionately in prison. So a large portion of their young men are in prison. We see this, so we think they are suffering. Now, if they are suffering because of racism and because they are a victim of white supremacists putting them down and keeping them down, if it is not their fault, then they can't change it, and they are pure victims. They cannot have any hope. But if their suffering is caused by something they are doing, then there's hope, because they can change and then get a new outcome. So it is better for them to take responsibility and say, my suffering is my own fault. I need to work harder. I need to study. I need to not have sex outside marriage and father a child. I need to get married and raise my children responsibly. I need, to do all of these things which would raise them out of poverty and give them a better life. So all this woman is saying is, if my unhappiness is my fault, then I can change. It is in my power to change. But if it's not my fault, if it is the fault of being or of the way the world is or of reality or even of God himself creating a terrible reality to cause me to suffer, well, then I am a pure victim and I have no hope. So that is what he is saying here. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I'm going to switch colors now. Alexander Solzhenitsyn had every reason to question the structure of existence when he was imprisoned in a Soviet labor camp in the middle of the terrible 20th century. He had served as a soldier on the ill-prepared Russian front lines in the face of a Nazi invasion. By the way, recently I watched a video series called The Cold War, What We Saw. I'm going to write it here. I recommend, if you want to learn something amazing in English, it's in English, that you watch this. It is 20th century history and really good information to give you wisdom. This history is very recent. Your grandparents were alive for this history, but it is being forgotten and about to be repeated. So, the Cold War, the Cold War, what we saw. The Cold War, what we saw. If you can look that up and watch it, that would be a good thing. Anyway, it would tell you what this means. Ill-prepared Russian front lines. Basically, the Russians were fighting tanks with horses and bayonets at one point. The Russians were able to throw millions of lives at the Nazis, but the Nazis had tanks. And so the Russians lost millions of soldiers and still lost ground. They were ill prepared. Nobody cared to give them what they needed to succeed, and they were all slaughtered. Terrible 20th century. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn had every reason to question the structure of existence. In other words, to say, life sucks. This world sucks. Anyone who created this world must be a monster. If this God exists, I spit on him and then die. That's the sentiment. So he had every reason to say that when he was imprisoned in a Soviet labor camp in the middle of the terrible 20th century. He had served as a soldier on the ill-prepared Russian front lines in the face of the Nazi invasion. So already he had suffered terribly and unfairly, and he had survived that. Now he is in a labor camp, suffering again unfairly. He had been arrested, beaten, and thrown into prison by his own people, the Russians. Then he was struck by cancer. We have a phrase in English, don't kick a man when he is down. You are not supposed to hurt someone even more when they are already hurt. But this terrible universe does that. It gave him cancer after he had already survived being a soldier on the Russian front line and a labor camp. He could have become resentful and bitter. His life had been rendered miserable by both Stalin and Hitler, two of the worst tyrants in history. He lived in brutal conditions in the labor camp. Vast stretches of his precious time were stolen from him and squandered. So like if his life is going to be 100 years, 30 years of it was spent in a prison camp. Those years of productivity and happiness stolen from him and squandered. That means wasted, with nothing good coming out of it. He witnessed the pointless and degrading suffering and death of his friends and acquaintances. So this is the key words, pointless and degrading suffering. Those are the key points of the nature of our existence, is that there's a lot of pointless suffering and, of course, degrading suffering. Degrading means humiliating. Then he contracted an extremely serious disease. So all of this is a recap. He suffered and then finally got cancer. Solzhenitsyn had cause to curse God. Job himself barely had it as hard. I hope you know who Job is. That word, J-O-B, usually is pronounced job. And usually it means your work, your employment. I need to go get a job and make some money. But People who have cultural literacy and know the Bible know that in this context, we would pronounce that Job, not Job. And Job is the name of a book in the Bible, and that book is named for the main character, Job. And the book of Job is the story of a man named Job who was terribly afflicted with horrible suffering by God because of a bet God had with the devil. Some people believe that the book of Job is fiction, that it is it's written as if it were a play to be given to an audience. Many people believe that the play was based on a real life guy. So we don't really know. But if Job was a real person, he was probably a contemporary of Abraham, the first of the fathers of the patriarchs of Judaism. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Abraham and Job would be contemporaries based on the date of the book of Job. Anyway, Job is all about a guy who suffered terribly through no fault of his own. And so Solzhenitsyn had cause to curse God. Job himself, we use the word himself to sort of amplify that this guy has the most cause. Job himself barely had it as hard, didn't really have, or just barely had, as bad a life as Solzhenitsyn. Also, there's a very famous line in the book of Job where Job's wife looks at him and says, "You should curse God and die. Curse God and die." That was her advice to her husband. So this whole thing is from the book of Job. So we have Solzhenitsyn, who had a terrible life. But you would think he would become angry. But the great writer, that is Solzhenitsyn is the great writer, the profound, spirited defender of truth, all of this describing Solzhenitsyn, did not allow his mind to turn toward vengeance and destruction. He opened his eyes instead. During his many trials, Solzhenitsyn encountered people who comported themselves nobly under horrific circumstances. So, during his many trials means while he was a soldier at the front and while he was a laborer in a labor camp, he met many people who comported themselves, that means they behaved or they acted nobly under horrific circumstances. So in those terrible trials, he saw people who were noble, and he realized, if they can do it, I can do it. Maybe I'm justified in being angry, but I don't want to be angry. I want to be noble. He contemplated their behavior deeply. So he didn't just notice it, he thought about it. He meditated on it. He gave it great thought. He ruminated on it, like a ruminant, a cow, chews. We say he ruminated upon it. He chewed it over is a phrase in English. He chewed it over and then he decided. So he contemplated the behavior of these noble people deeply. Then he asked himself, the most difficult of questions. Had he personally contributed to the catastrophe of his life? And if so, how? In other words, was it his own fault that he was suffering in any way? Had he even contributed? That means, was it at all his fault that he was suffering? And that is the most difficult question to ask. Have I caused this? Is it my fault? Is it my own fault? He remembered this is Solzhenitsyn again, he remembered his unquestioning support of the Communist Party in his early years. So apparently Solzhenitsyn voted for the communists, the Bolsheviks. Apparently Solzhenitsyn believed in communism in the beginning, before it became evil and ugly, or before he could see that it was evil. So, is this my own fault? Well, I supported communism in the beginning. I put them in power. So he remembered that. He reconsidered his whole life. He had plenty of time in the camps. So he thought through his whole life during his years when he was in the prison camp. How had he missed the mark in the past? Missed the mark is another phrase that means sin. Sin is missing the mark. Missing the mark also means falling short, moral failure. How had he failed morally in the past? How many times had he acted against his own conscience? So act against your conscience means do something that you know is wrong. Engaging in actions that he knew to be wrong. So how many times had he done that? How many times had he betrayed himself and lied? Betrayed himself means done what he knew to be wrong again, or done something dishonest to himself and lied. So this is about honesty. Was there any way that the sins of his past could be rectified, atoned for, in the muddy hell of a Soviet gulag? Rectified means put right. Is there any way he could make the sins he committed 20 years ago, make it right now? For example, he had supported the Communist Party. He had told others, it's good, vote for them, support them. Well, he could rectify that by writing a book exposing the evil and trying to get people not to support communism. That would rectify that particular sin of the past. So rectify means make it right. Atone for is different. Atone for more or less means pay for it. So take the punishment is atone. So is there any way he could rectify the sins of the past and atone for them in the muddy hell of a Soviet gulag? The labor camps were called gulags. Next paragraph. Solzhenitsyn pored over the details of his life. So when you pore over something, you read it carefully, you think about it, you comb through it with detail. Lots and lots of time and attention. Not miss one bit. Look at the whole thing. That's what it means to pore through something, like a big book or something. He pored over the details of his life with a fine-toothed comb. When a child or a person has head lice, little bugs and things that lay eggs in your hair, you have to fine-tooth comb to get the nits out, the eggs. You must have a fine-tooth comb. So when it says poured over with a fine-tooth comb, it talks about, I don't want to miss even the smallest sin. I want to notice everything. I want to draw out everything I have done that was wrong so that I can rectify it and change and atone for it and have a new life. So he pored over the details of his life with a fine-toothed comb. He asked himself a second question and a third. These are the questions. Can I stop making such mistakes? In other words, can I stop making the mistakes I used to make? He's not saying, can I not make any mistakes in the future? He means, can I learn from those? Can I stop making those mistakes? Such mistakes. Now, can I now not make the mistakes of the past? And can I repair the damage done by my past failures now? So those are his two questions. Can I stop doing it and fix it? He learned to watch and to listen. He found people he admired who were honest despite everything. So he found people who were honest in spite of the fact that they could be killed for refusing to say what the master told them to say or believe what the propaganda taught. He learned to, He took himself apart, piece by piece, let what was unnecessary and harmful die, and resurrected himself. Then he wrote the Gulag Archipelago. This is a great book. I actually have it. It's huge, and I haven't read it, but I bought it not too long ago, and I'm going to read it. He wrote the Gulag Archipelago because they had gulags that were like prison camps all over northern Russia and Siberia. And each one was like an island in an ocean of snow and ice. So an archipelago is a series of islands. So he wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, which is a history of the Soviet prison camp system. It is a forceful, terrible book, written with the overwhelming moral force of unvarnished truth. Unvarnished means he did not soften anything. He did not pretty it up. He told it exactly how it was. And this gave it overwhelming moral force. Its sheer outrage screamed unbearably across hundreds of pages. Sheer outrage. Sheer means pure, nothing but outrage. Outrage is like the shaking the fist. The sheer outrage screamed unbearably across hundreds of pages. Banned in the USSR. So his book was banned in Russia. And it says, and for good reason. In other words, the Russians were smart to ban that book in Russia. So his book was banned in Russia. Couldn't read it, couldn't buy it, couldn't produce it. But, in fact, they tried to destroy it. But a draft was smuggled to the West. So they snuck it out of the country. Snuck is the past tense of sneak. So basically they wanted to sneak over the border with the book hidden in their luggage. They did that, so it's past tense. They snuck it out of Russia and published it in the West in the 1970s. And the book burst upon the world. You know, the communists lie in print. They have propaganda that says that their citizens are happy, productive, they love their government, they love their lives, they are prosperous, they're in agreement with everything that's happening. But this book told the truth about the horrible prison camp system, mostly for political dissidents. Solzhenitsyn's writing utterly and finally demolished the intellectual credibility of communism as ideology or society. So, in other words, no thinking person could ever again believe that communism was a reasonable ideology or that it produced a reasonable society. Of course, this history is suppressed, and it's threatening in Brazil and in America. Socialism is taking over, but really it's closer and closer to true communism. In fact, communism is openly taking over in many countries that were formerly free. Solzhenitsyn, meaning he, took an axe to the trunk of the tree whose bitter fruits had nourished him so poorly. So the trunk of the tree is communism. He took an axe to the trunk of communism because communism had nourished him so poorly. In other words, it had hurt him. And whose planting he had witnessed and supported. So he had witnessed the beginning of communism and supported it. Now he cut it down with his book to atone for his sin and to rectify it. One man's decision to change his life instead of cursing fate. So he's going to change his own life instead of cursing fate as though he is a victim of fate. So he's taking responsibility instead of being a victim. One man's decision to do this shook the whole pathological system of communist tyranny to its core. One man shook communism to the core. It crumbled entirely. Communism, the USSR, crumbled entirely not so many years later, pretty soon. And Solzhenitsyn's courage was not the least of the reasons why. Not the least. This is a double negative. It's got not and least, which means lowest. So not the least means it was one of the most important reasons. One of the most important reasons why communism crumbled was because Solzhenitsyn exposed the truth. He, Solzhenitsyn, was not the only such person to perform such a miracle. Václav Havel, the persecuted writer who later, impossibly, became the president of Czechoslovakia, and then the new Czech Republic, comes to mind, as does Mahatma Gandhi. So these people, Václav Havel and Mahatma Gandhi, are also individuals. They are one man who had an outsized impact on the world and on history because instead of being a victim of unjust suffering and just shaking their fist, cursing God and dying, they decided to take responsibility for their own actions to both rectify their past sins, atone for their past sins, and move forward into nobility. So that is the end of Vengeance or Transformation. I think this next section, Things Fall Apart, is kind of small, so we may be able to do it. It is pretty small. It's just this much, plus this much, plus this. Okay, let's get started at least. with things fall apart. Whole peoples, hold on. Let's get a new color. Let's go to black. Whole peoples have adamantly refused to judge reality, to criticize being, to blame God. All of these are synonyms. They all mean the same thing, although they give a slightly different understanding of the action of nihilistically becoming angry, seeking vengeance, curse God, and die. Whole peoples have adamantly refused to do this. It's interesting to consider the Old Testament in this regard, the Old Testament Hebrews in this regard. Their travails followed a consistent pattern. Travails is suffering and difficulties. Followed a consistent pattern. The stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and Noah and the Tower of Babel are truly ancient. These stories are at the very dawn of humanity. And they reflect something very deep in our psyche. This is Jordan Peterson's idea that he said in previous chapters. So they're truly ancient. Their origins vanish into the mysteries of time. It is not until after the flood story in Genesis that something like history as we understand it starts. It starts with Abraham. Abraham's descendants become the Hebrew people as the Hebrew Bible. They enter a covenant with Yahweh, their God, who is God, and begin their recognizably historical adventures. So the Hebrew people, after the flood of Genesis, which I believe and many people believe was an actual historical event. Previous to the flood, you had Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and the Tower of Babel and all these things which are so ancient. They're before the flood. They're basically almost prehistory. But after the flood, we begin to have history. That is attested to by sources other than the Bible. But the Bible itself is unbelievably ancient in its writings. So the Hebrew people really did exist. They really did have, they have a history that we know. And this history follows a pattern. Under the leadership of a great man, the Hebrews organized themselves into a society and then an empire. As their fortunes rise, so things get good for them, the more successful they are, the more proud and arrogant they become. Corruption raises its ugly head. The increasingly hubristic state, meaning the government of this group, becomes increasingly proud and egocentric and, basically proud, full of hubris, becomes obsessed with power and begins to forget its duty to the widows and orphans, because the government God gave for Israel was a very just and a very compassionate government. So they begin to forget their duty and they deviate from its age-old agreement with God. From the very beginning, Israel was God's people. They were not supposed to worship other gods, but they forgot. Then a prophet will arise. So this happened over and over again in history. It's called the cycle of the prophets. The historical event just kept happening, just like this. There would be a great man, they would rise, they would do well, then they would forget God, fall into sin. A prophet would arise, they would repent, they would do well, then they would get corrupt, then they would fall into sin, then a prophet would arise, they would repent, they would begin to do well, This cycle was repeated over and over in Israel's history, and it's called the cycle of the prophets. Anyway, this prophet would brazenly and publicly revile the authoritarian king and the faithless country for their failures before God, which was an act of blind courage. And he would tell them of the terrible judgment to come. So that's what the prophet would do. When his wise words are not completely ignored, sometimes they ignored the prophets. But if they didn't, hold on. Well, usually, if they are not completely ignored, they are often heeded too late. And God smites his wayward people. So catastrophe happens, dooming them to abject defeat in battle. Hold on. Abject defeat in battle and generations of subjugation. The Hebrews repent at length, meaning after a while, blaming their misfortune on their own failure to adhere to God's word. So they don't blame their misfortune on God. They blame it on themselves. They take responsibility. They insist to themselves. So they're speaking to themselves, to one another. Their idea that is common in their society is that they could have done better. They should have done better. And they rebuild their state, and then the cycle begins again. So as Jordan Peterson says, this is life. This cycle is life. We build structures to live in. We build families and states and countries. We abstract the principles upon which those structures are founded and formulate systems of belief. At first, we inhabit the structures and beliefs. Makes us complacent. That definitely happened in America. We forget to pay attention. We take what we have for granted. If you take something for granted, you don't appreciate it. So we take it for granted. We turn a blind eye. So people are doing bad stuff in America that isn't according to our values. But instead of calling it out, remember last lesson I talked about what does it mean to call someone out? It means to point out to them their failure. So like in America, we start having abortion, and instead of calling it out, many people turn a blind eye. Turn a blind eye means pretend it is not happening, even though you know it is. So we turn a blind eye. We fail to notice that things are changing, like that we are losing our identity as the people of God, something like that. Or we fail to notice that corruption is taking root and everything falls apart. Is that the fault of reality? Of God? Or do things fall apart because we have not paid attention? So whose fault is it when things fall apart after we have neglected them? Another example. When the hurricane hit New Orleans a few years ago and the town sank under the waves, was that a natural disaster? Many people would say, yes, it's a natural disaster. The Dutch people in Holland prepare their dikes for the worst storm in 10,000 years. Dikes are the structures of earth and clay that are built up in Holland to keep back the sea. They have been engineered to be strong enough to withstand the worst storm, according to this, in 10,000 years. Had New Orleans followed their example and fortified their seawalls, no tragedy would have occurred. You might say, well, they didn't know that this might happen. Not true. It says here, it's not that no one knew. They knew. The Flood Control Act of 1965, that's a law that they made in 1965, mandated improvements in the levee system that held back Lake Pontchartrain. The system was to be completed by 1978. So in 1965, New Orleans passed a law that they had to correct the levee system that lets water go and relieves the pressure on the seawalls to hold back the lake. And the law said that the work had to be completed by 1978. Many laws have this kind of a time frame. 40 years later, in, I don't know if it's 40 years from 1978 or 40 years from 1965, 40 years later, the hurricane came, and only 60% of the work had been done. So they didn't follow their own law. They neglected it. The same thing happened to the United States with respect to respirator machines. Apparently, maybe 20 years ago, with a SARS virus, the supply of masks and gloves and respirators and all that, they discovered that we didn't have enough, and they passed a law saying we needed to create a national stockpile of these kinds of materials. But it wasn't done. And when the coronavirus, the Wuhan flu, hit America, and they looked for those materials, they weren't there. Willful blindness and corruption took the city down in New Orleans. Same here in America. People just didn't bother to resupply the national stockpile, emergency stockpiles. So, a hurricane is an act of God, but failure to prepare when the necessity for preparation is known, well, that's a sin. That's failure to hit the mark. And the wages of sin is death, which is a verse in the Bible in the book of Romans, chapter 6, verse 23. The wages of sin is death. In other words, the penalty of sin is death. The ancient Jews always blamed themselves when things fell apart. They acted as if God's goodness, the goodness of reality, was axiomatic. That means they acted as if it was a definite fact that God is good and that his world and his reality is good and just. We don't even have to question that. We know God is good. We know the world and reality are good. If we are suffering, it must be us. It must be our fault. So, they acted, not just they thought, but they acted as if God's goodness was axiomatic, and they took responsibility for their own failure. To take responsibility means to take it on yourself, to have the duty to fix the error and to atone for the problem. That's insanely responsible, meaning that's very, very much responsibility to take on yourself. But The alternative is to judge reality as insufficient, to criticize being itself, and to sink into resentment and the desire for revenge. So it's insanely responsible to expect someone to take responsibility for their own suffering when they are suffering like Solzhenitsyn did at the hands of first the communists, then the Nazis, and then cancer. You wouldn't expect someone to take responsibility. It's crazy to do that. But if you don't, you will become angry and hateful and begin to say, God did it. Life sucks and he created it, so he sucks. So curse God and die. So those are your choices. You can take responsibility and not be a victim and become something noble and good, or you can be a victim and degenerate into corruption and die angry. If you are suffering, well, that's the norm. That means that's normal. Everybody suffers, good and bad, people alike. So if you are suffering, well, that's the norm. People are limited. That means people are going to hurt you because they're not perfect. And life is tragic. I mean, everybody has tragedy in their lives. If your suffering is unbearable, however, and you are starting to become corrupted with anger, your suffering is unbearable, and you're beginning to think, I'm going to get a gun and kill people and then kill myself. You're beginning to want to get revenge on the world, he says. Well, here's something to think about. Here's something to think about. And then it moves on, which we don't have time for. So here's something to think about. Next week, we will think about it. So if your suffering is unbearable and you are beginning to be corrupted, stay tuned. We'll have something for you to think about next week. See you later.